Venezuela just exploded back into the headlines. And if you're hearing that this is the start of a global war or something massive, stick with me for a few minutes. Because what I'm about to break down sounds dramatic and dangerous, but it's not what people think. By the end of this, you'll see why most of the loud theories out there fall apart the moment you actually think them through. So, a lot of you have been writing in, messaging, commenting, asking what this actually means now that Venezuela's political leadership has been effectively decapitated. For anyone who's been off grid for a few days, yes, U.S. Special Operations went in, Maduro is gone, and he's now facing a long list of charges that have been building quietly for years. And no, this wasn't some impulsive decision cooked up over a weekend. This was a slow burn file that finally reached the point where the risk of doing nothing was judged to be greater than the risk of acting. The real problem is that once something like this happens, people immediately start stacking assumptions on top of assumptions, and that's where things get sloppy. The first big idea I want to put down gently and then bury is the notion that Venezuela was on the verge of becoming some kind of forward operating base for an attack on the United States itself. You've probably seen the posts, the maps, the dramatic arrows pointing north. The theory usually involves drones, sometimes missiles, sometimes vague foreign technology. The problem is that geography and physics don't care about internet theories. You're talking about enormous distances over open ocean. That immediately wipes out the vast majority of systems people like to imagine. Long-range strike drones that can cross that kind of distance, navigate accurately and hit meaningful targets are extremely rare, extremely expensive, and extremely sophisticated. Venezuela does not possess them. They can barely keep their civilian aviation sector functioning. And even the countries that do have long-range unmanned systems rely heavily on satellite guidance, layered command and control, and secure communications infrastructure. Venezuela has none of that in a form that could support offensive operations. Even if, and this is a massive if, some external actor tried to stage something from Venezuelan territory, you immediately run into the problem of outcomes. What are you actually hitting? The only realistic urban target of scale is Miami. And let's be very clear here. Miami is not a strategic military hub whose destruction changes the balance of power. Any attack of that kind wouldn't weaken the United States. It would unify it instantly. It would guarantee overwhelming retaliation not just against the delivery system, but against whoever was perceived to be behind it. And every serious state actor on the planet understands this. So the idea that this was a preemptive move to stop an imminent strike on the US mainland just doesn't hold up. Welcome to Geopolitics with Eric. Next comes the argument that this somehow gives Russia an excuse or an opening to escalate directly against the United States. This one ignores reality so aggressively that it almost feels like performance art. Russia is already maxed out. Their military is bogged down in a grinding war that has consumed personnel, equipment, logistics, and political capital at an astonishing rate. They are not sitting on spare divisions, spare fleets, or spare attention waiting for a chance to poke Washington. In fact, they've pulled resources from places they previously considered untouchable just to keep their current front from collapsing. The idea that they would voluntarily open a second front, especially one that risks direct confrontation with the United States, makes no strategic sense whatsoever. People also love to resurrect Cold War nostalgia here, talking about staging weapons in the Caribbean, as if it's still 1962. That world doesn't exist anymore. Countries like Cuba are not eager participants in someone else's suicide pact. They understand perfectly well that hosting foreign offensive systems aimed at the United States would not bring protection. It would bring annihilation. And unlike during the Cold War, there is no superpower patron capable of shielding them from consequences. Modern Russia cannot project power the way the Soviet Union once did, and everyone involved knows it. Putin, above all people, knows it. He is cautious to the point of paranoia when his own survival is on the line, and history shows that when faced with direct personal risk, he backs down. It's also worth remembering that the United States has a long and well-documented tendency to respond disproportionately when it feels directly threatened. Past examples show that even symbolic challenges can trigger massive responses. Russian leadership understands this deeply, not as theory, but as lived experience. That's why their preferred method has never been direct confrontation. It's always been indirect pressure, disinformation, internal division, and proxy chaos. They don't want the US swinging at them. They want the US swinging at itself or at someone else. That's why you should always be skeptical of narratives that seem designed to provoke emotional overreaction rather than careful analysis. Another claim floating around is that this move sets some kind of precedent that authoritarian powers will now use to justify their own aggression. In practical terms, that's almost meaningless. Countries that are willing to invade, annex, or destabilize their neighbors don't need permission slips. They don't wait for moral cover from Washington's behavior. If they did, the last decade of global events wouldn't look the way it does. Russia doesn't need justification to continue its war. It's already crossed every imaginable line. China doesn't need justification to threaten Taiwan. That rhetoric has been baked into its political messaging for decades. These regimes operate on capability and opportunity, not on legal or ethical consistency. China, in particular, gets dragged into this conversation a lot, usually by people who imagine military operations as simple overnight switches you flip on and off. Amphibious invasion at scale is one of the most complex operations any military can attempt. It requires overwhelming logistical superiority, operational experience, and the ability to sustain forces across water under hostile conditions. China has been modernizing aggressively, but modernization does not equal readiness. Their armed forces are also in the middle of significant internal purges, which is never a sign of institutional stability. And if they genuinely believed they could take Taiwan quickly and cleanly, they wouldn't still be talking about it this loudly. The volume of rhetoric is often inversely proportional to actual readiness. Then there's the idea that Venezuela was some kind of warm-up act, a rehearsal before a much bigger target like Iran. This misunderstands almost everything about how different political systems function. Venezuela under Maduro was a classic strongman structure with a narrow elite cluster controlling power and resources. Remove the top and the system collapses quickly because there's very little depth. Iran is the opposite. It's layered, institutionalized, and deeply embedded in religious, military, and economic networks. You're not talking about a few dozen decision makers, you're talking about thousands. Even removing the most visible figures would not dismantle the regime. It would adapt, harden, and likely radicalize further. Geography also matters, and it matters a lot. Caracas is close to the coast. Iran's power centers are not. Any attempt to directly extract or neutralize leadership there would involve operating deep inland across difficult terrain and densely populated areas. History is not kind to those kinds of missions. The United States learned that lesson decades ago, and there's no appetite for repeating it. That doesn't mean U.S. policy toward Iran won't evolve or become more aggressive in other ways. But the idea that this was a dry run simply doesn't align with operational reality. What this really comes down to is that people tend to assume every dramatic action must be part of an even more dramatic master plan. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's the resolution of a long-standing problem that finally crossed a threshold where inaction became riskier than action. Venezuela had become a hub for criminal networks, illicit finance, and destabilizing activity with very little internal resistance left to restrain it. Removing the leadership doesn't solve everything, but it removes a keystone that was holding a lot of bad behavior in place. The mistake now would be to project this event outward into fantasies about global war, imminent invasions, or cascading collapse. Serious governments don't make decisions based on internet hysteria, and serious analysts don't evaluate events by stacking worst-case scenarios on top of each other. They look at capability, intent, and constraint. When you do that here, the picture becomes a lot less dramatic and a lot more grounded. So if you're feeling like the world just lurched closer to the edge, take a breath. This wasn't a signal flare for chaos. It was a targeted move in a very specific context, against a very specific type of regime, under very specific conditions. Conflating it with every other global tension doesn't clarify anything. It just feeds noise. And the more noise there is, the harder it becomes to see the real risks when they actually do emerge.